This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
There have been studies that have talked about children of divorce are more adaptable because they needed to be. And I think there's a lot of value in being able to cope and adapt. You know, that's another benefit that people can derive from divorce. And I'm not saying that would be the reason you do it, but I am saying that, you know, there are perks to the whole situation that could be beneficial to your children.
Welcome to the Parent Footprint Podcast with Dr. Dan. I am Dr. Dan, your host, and let me tell you about our mission at Parent Footprint. That mission is to make the world a more loving and compassionate place, one parent and one child at a time. We believe the key to raising happy, healthy, and engaged kids is for us parents to seek the same in our own lives: happiness, health, and engagement. We believe that awareness is the foundation for your vision of successful parenting, and with increased awareness and intention, we can be purposeful about leaving a healthy footprint on our children. Today's show is called How Parents Can Talk to Their Children About Divorce. And I'm excited to introduce you to our guest, Jacqueline Newman. Jacqueline is the managing partner at the matrimonial law firm Berkman, Bottger, Newman, and Schein in Manhattan. Her practice consists of litigation, collaborative law, and mediation, and she specializes in complex, high net worth matrimonial cases and also negotiating prenuptial agreements. She is the author of her new book, The New Rules of Divorce: 12 Secrets of Protecting Your Wealth, Health, and Happiness. And get this, Oprah says this is one of the best divorce books to help you heal during every stage of the process. Jacqueline has been on a number of news shows as an expert, including NBC, Fox Business, ABC, CBS, the New York Times, New York Post, and a whole bunch of other highly esteemed publications. And with that, Jacqueline, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with your road to becoming an attorney and having this specialty.
So, believe it or not, as odd as it sounds, I've always wanted to be a divorce attorney since like junior high. And the joke is that there's no divorce in my family until you go like 5 degrees out.
Wow.
But my parents are both psychotherapists. And so the big family joke was that I was too aggressive to be a therapist. So kind of a matrimonial attorney seemed like the next best thing. And I've loved it. I've put all my eggs in one basket. I focused on it in college, focused it on law school. And, you know, luckily I found the right people and I've been doing it for the last 20 years. I've never done anything else and I love it.
You knew. You had your calling. And I find it interesting. I have to ask this question. What is it like being raised by 2 mental health professionals?
Well, the thing I tell people a lot is I was allowed to keep my room as messy as I wanted because my parents said I was expressing myself. They would just close the door and it was my space. And suffice it to say, it was covered in clothes like 80% of the time. But you know.
Yeah. Well, so you had something they did for you is allow you to be who you were.
Absolutely. No, my parents are great.
So, okay. So I have to ask about conflict. A lot of times us mental health types actually aren't all that great with conflict. And I know from my legal experiences as expert witness and such, like that is not comfortable for me. And so knowing that a lot of attorneys that I do know are really comfortable with conflict. So how do you see conflict in your work?
So, you know, conflict, I mean, look, can I say it's the most comfortable thing in the world? No, it's not. That said, I really see conflict as an opportunity for discussion and an opportunity for people to be able to see different views. because, if everybody's agreeing all the time, then you're always on the same page. But you know what? Sometimes you can grow a lot from a conflict, especially if you handle it in the right way. When I'm having a disagreement with someone, I'm open to hearing what their view is. It may change my view. It may not, but at least it's going to open my perspective. And you know what? In the future, when I'm in another situation that may be similar to that, I'm going to be able to kind of hear that other person's view in my mind. And again, may or may not agree, but it's always a learning experience. So I see conflict as something that you can really grow from if you approach it in the right way.
And has your perspective changed how you approach conflict and settlement and negotiation? I mean, I imagine over the plus 20 years that you've been doing this, I'm just interested in what you've seen and learned from all of your experience.
Oh, absolutely. I think as I've gotten older and more comfortable in my skin and have been doing this for a long time, I am much more comfortable with conflict, but I also don't let it faze me in the way that it did. Like when I was a young lawyer and just starting out, I definitely would write like these fiery letters and I'd get all defensive. And if someone said something to me, I'd feel the need to prove myself right all the time. And, all of those things that you do when you're a little bit less secure. And now, if someone starts yelling at me, I say, just because you say it loud doesn't make it more right. Or if somebody, writes me a nasty letter, like I skim the whole thing. And the only thing I say, so they want to pick up the kids at 6:30 and not 6:45. Like, for me, I don't get phrased at this point. I mean, it takes a lot to kind of rattle me. Maybe I become, jaded to it all. But I don't view conflict and I don't view all of this in the same way that I definitely did when I was younger. I mean, now I've kind of gotten to a point where I'm comfortable enough. I actually see it somewhat, depending on how you handle the conflict. If you're screaming and yelling and carrying on, I actually see that as a sign of insecurity. Like you feel a need to put on a show. That means that you don't have enough substance behind what you're actually saying.
And I think that I agree with that, and that's far-reaching, just across all of our areas of life, right? How much of a show do we need to put on based on our inner confidence and or insecurity? So as we record this show, we are in the midst of COVID-19, and many of us on the West Coast, you on the East Coast, have been sheltered in place in some capacity for some time now. For us, it's been about a month, and I know that your area has been hit really hard. So I'd like us to talk about divorce and divorce rates and the process, both with a deep dive and then a broad slice. So what I mean by that is, what has the divorce rate been? Has it changed? And what are we going to see, or are we seeing, with these unprecedented living circumstances we're all in?
So historically, divorce rates, you hear they're 50%. That's not 100% true. It's kind of like a rounding. Generally, actually, they've been a little bit lower of late. And part of the reason I think of that is, first of all, a lot less people are getting married. They do a lot of the Goldie Hawn, Kurt Russell kind of thing. And I think that you have a lot of people in different types of relationships. So that, I really think, so the divorce rate is lower, but I don't know if, people breaking up in their relationships. I think a definition of relationship had changed a lot. That said, from a prediction going forward, if other countries are any indication and just, seeing what's going on. I mean, I think divorce rates are going to skyrocket after, we're all kind of allowed out of our homes. And part of the reason being is that we are living in a very unnatural way. And I think that marriages that were kind of on the brink, this is going to definitely be something that is going to push them over the edge. So, we're getting a lot of phone calls from people that are basically, looking to explore their options because, the circumstances are so difficult. And my advice to them really is like, just stop and think for a second. Like, I understand, obviously, we're all living in incredibly stressful, unprecedented times. I have a lot of people that say, well, what did you do when this happened? A situation like this. I was like, there's never been a situation like this. Like, this is really, unknown. And, my point to people a lot is like, I want you to just sit and breathe for a second, because I wouldn't say what's going on right now is an indication of what your future is going to be. Because I think that people, some people are behaving, really well. And I think that this could be strengthening some relationships, definitely, and some family dynamics. There's a lot of positives in it, but some people are not handling it as well. And I think that, in these kinds of stress, it doesn't necessarily mean that your whole marriage is doomed because things were fine before and now they're not. That said, I think, unfortunately, domestic violence has increased. There's been a lot of circumstances that have put people in a position that really should be moving forward with divorce, once this is over.
Yeah, and for all of those reasons, hoping that people can get space from people when they're in an unsafe and unhealthy situation. And of course, as our focus is on parenting on this show and raising healthy people and the undeniable negative impact it has on kids when parents have high conflict and, of course, violence as well.
100%. I mean, one of the things actually, and especially this is a good platform to talk about this, given the audience of your show, is that something that I think is going on in this COVID experience that people are not giving enough attention to are their children. And when I say that, I mean that, parents, obviously this is a stressful time for everyone. And adults, no one knows when it's going to end. No one knows what it's going to mean. You're watching your assets drop in the market. You have job instability. You have people working from home. You have children that are homeschooled. I mean, there are so many reasons why this is a really difficult, stressful situation. However, I feel like people, when I say people, I'm saying parents, a lot of them are so caught in where they are right now because they're so scared, and all these things make a lot of sense. But I feel like the stability that they need to show to their children, I am seeing, unfortunately, that people are not doing as well as they should. Mm-hmm. Because as scared as adults are, just imagine what children are going through. Children need routine. They need structure. Their structures and routines are completely out of whack. Mm-hmm. And they have parents that they're watching who are stressed out and don't have answers for them, which, is understandable because there are no answers right now. But I think that, a lot of people are forgetting how incredibly scary this is for children. And I think that there just has to be a lot more attention paid to children and providing them with as much structure, as much foundation as you can, and as much love and support. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately in my field, I am having a lot of people that are using this opportunity to disrupt custody agreements. I have people that, legitimately or not, are, withholding children from their other parent because, they're scared of the COVID virus, or they're keeping kids, outside of New York City because they have houses in the Hamptons, and all sorts of things are happening. And I think it's, while I could see arguments sort of for both, I think that what this is doing is taking a child who's already, uplifted from their lives and now possibly cutting out the access to the other parent, which is just even worse. Mm-hmm. And so, my attitude is you can never have too much love for a child and support for a child. And I feel like this is the time more than ever that parents have to really kind of put their own personal gripes aside and do everything they can to let their children get through this experience as unscathed as possible.
I so appreciate you making that point. And again, we are in unprecedented, stressful times, and then folks going through divorce and high conflict divorce, we know that it just adds a whole level of stress, and people go into the process or coming out of the process often very different than when they went into it. And, when we look at how important parents are in kids' lives, it goes back to when kids fall. What do? They look at us to decide whether they should cry, be scared, be hurt, or they should just say no big deal and move on. They're always looking to us, and they are looking at us and our behavior and our fear and our worry and our out of control behavior, perhaps, when we really need to show them stability and, it's going to be okay. We're going to figure this out. Even when we don't have all the answers, right? Like we have to provide this sense of security during this totally unfathomable, surreal time we're living in. And again, to your point, it's to have the added stress of divorce, but I'm also thinking there's probably a difference in your clientele and in your work between is regular divorce and high conflict divorce as well in this situation.
Absolutely. And, and I will say, some parents, I actually have a case right now where I would have considered this case very high conflict, but for whatever reason, these people are actually coming together and really getting on the same page. I mean, it's mind-boggling to watch because these people couldn't agree what day it was. And now, because they have, they're both rising to the occasion, and the way that they're handling this whole COVID situation and handling, the access to their children and locations. They both have, one, as I said, is outside the city, one's inside the city. And I really think this is actually going to put us in a position that when this is all over, we're going to be able to settle the custody aspects of their divorce. And, it's one of those opportunities that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. I don't think these people could have kind of gotten past themselves before, but they really have united when it comes to their children. So I think that, there are certain things, there are some people that are kind of coming together, but, as you said, yes, there are a lot of people that are not. And when you have regular divorce, as you say, and high conflict, unfortunately, I have other cases where, what was a regular divorce has now become a high conflict.
So since we're focused on, healthy parent equals healthy child, what do people how has the divorce landscape changed over the years, and what do people need to be aware of when they take this step?
So, we're going to kind of talk in a non-COVID time, but even in a COVID time. I mean, one of the things I talk a lot about in my book is, about how things have changed and how people really need to be aware of the change. And one of the biggest changes that, it's interesting, what's happening before the COVID situation, and I think it's going to accelerate even greatly because of the COVID situation, is the role that fathers are playing now in their children's lives. So back in the day, a father would get every other weekend and Wednesday night dinners. Like that was kind of your standard thing. That is not the case anymore. More and more, I have now fathers that are coming into my office. They want 50-50 custody. And I say, great, and we're seeing more and more of these parenting arrangements where, fathers are very involved in the day-to-day child raising. And, and that's a shift. And when you have a mother who, let's say, has sacrificed her career and is home with the children full time, it is a very hard pill for them to swallow. And it's something that, I highlight a lot in my book. And I really want women and men to know this, because this is how courts are looking at it. Like, we're not fully at the place where a court would say, why shouldn't it be 50-50? But we're very close. And I think that, and it will be interesting because now that, fathers who may have been more in the workforce and not involved in the day-to-day schooling and child rearing activities, being now sitting in a home with their child for 1 month, 2 months, however long this is going to be, is really going to engage them much more so in the daily, knowing what's going on in school, being more involved in everything. And I think that my guess is that custody is going to change so drastically, and the custody asks are going to change drastically because after this, they know they can do it now. They have these relationships, like all sorts of things are forming that would never have formed in, normal circumstances. So I think even more so, we're going to be dealing with a lot more fathers that are going to be asking for 50-50 time, or maybe even more, who knows? I think it's going to have a major shift on custody.
Does that change the actual process of how parents enter the situation, or is it more about for people to have different expectations perhaps going in?
I think it's a little bit of both. Definitely expectations. From a process standpoint, I mean, a lot of people don't get divorced because of the kids. You hear that all the time. And, and if I'm being sexist and making these statements, obviously this can, switch. But if you have, very often you'll have a father that, is not home, as often as he wants to be and works late nights and travels, et cetera, and doesn't want to get divorced because, as, many of my clients have said, like, I don't want to not sleep under the same roof with my children. And they're scared that if they get divorced, they won't have time with their children and all of that. And as I said, it's because the courts are shifting. And because I do think after this, courts are going to shift even, further, I think that the process will be different because I think that people will be looking to get divorced. They won't allow the idea that they won't see their children to be the reason why they don't get divorced in the same way that they may have before.
So when you have a chapter that is focused on self-care, and as a continuing theme, as we're going to keep talking about, is healthy parent, healthy child, and not healthy parent, it makes it really hard for a child. So what do you recommend to folks about self-care as they embark on this divorce process?
Well, I mean, the title to the chapter, and I think it really, I was kind of excited when I came up with this one, is you need to put on your own oxygen mask first. Self-care is key. And I really believe that. And I say, like, anytime I'm on an airplane, which now probably won't be for a while, but anytime I'm on an airplane and I hear them talk about, make sure you put your own mask on first, because my gut would be to put my mask on my child first. It wouldn't even, every time I hear it, I always think to myself how counterintuitive that feels to me, because I would always want to do my children first. But they're 100% right, because if I'm not breathing, I'm not going to be able to function to take care of my children. And I think that that same theory applies so much to divorce, so much to many things, as a whole. Like, I do agree with you, healthy parent, healthy child, but especially during divorce, because, during divorce, people become narcissistic on some level. They just do. Their lives are crumbling. They have, fears, anxieties, stresses, all sorts of things going on. And it's, you can get lost in that. And, and if I ask anyone who comes into my office, what's your main concern? 99% of the time they say the children. I just need to make sure my children are okay. I need to make sure, and money comes in too. I don't want to pretend it doesn't. So 99 might have been a little high, but conceptually, I'd say 90% of the time, it's all about taking care of my children. And, they say that, but then when they're going through the divorce and they're, whispering but pretty loud to their friends and their kids are in the next room, cursing at their spouse or whatever it is they're doing, like, kids are incredibly perceptive. They know what's going on. So you need to make sure that you are putting yourself in a healthy, good spot and being aware of what you're going through and taking care of it in order to be in the healthy spot for your children. And when I say taking care of it, so I'm a big advocate of people being in therapy when they're going through a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
Big advocate of, people creating their own identities. I mean, that's something else I talk about in the book. And I think it is really important, because what happens a lot when you have a parent that has dedicated their lives to their children and do not have outside activities, whether it be, charitable work, a job, good friendship groups, support groups, whatever it is. Like, I always say, like, if your only identity is so-and-so's parent or so-and-so's spouse, you need to have identities that are not tied to somebody else, because that's very, very important. And it's important for many things. I mean, even just specifically speaking, you're now going to have your child maybe half of the time. And, what are you going to do in that dead time when your children aren't with you, when, they have been your main focus? And I think that that's a really important thing. You need to fill that time with things that better you as a person. I always say, like, take another language, read your favorite book, do the hobby. If you are working, work for that big promotion. Like, do whatever it is you need to do that makes you happy and makes you fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're able to do that and create that element of sort of separation from your children on some level, from an identity standpoint, it will help. It will help make you a stronger person to be in the best position to parent your children. Because if everything is tied to your children, that's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure on that relationship with your children. It's a lot of pressure on you. And some children can feel the pressure on them. A lot of kids will adopt, in a divorce perspective, the feeling of needing to take care of the parent that they see to be the weaker parent, the hurt parent, whatever it is. Kids shouldn't be doing that. Kids should be kids. They should not be involved in taking care of their parents. And so I think that all of this, like, you need to take care of you.
Mm-hmm.
So you can be in the best position to take care of them.
Yeah, and that helps. I mean, like you said, everyone wants the best for their kids, and this is the number one thing that parents can do for their kids is engage in their own lives and model that for their kids. Because we always think about somewhere over the years, it's become about quantity of time instead of quality of time, and parents, went from spending not as much time with their kids to spending a ton of time with their kids. We talk about dads and moms at every soccer game and coaching every event on every field trip. Like, it didn't used to be that way. And with that quantity, I think what gets missed is that our kids develop a secure attachment to us and to themselves when they feel secure in the world. And they feel secure in the world when their parents are doing okay, and their parents have good relationships, and their parents have places they like to go, and they see their parents exercise, and they see their parents say, sorry, I need to do this for myself right now, but I will get back to you. Like, that is actually healthy. And so I know that for many of us, when we are stressed out, when we are dealing with depression, we're dealing with anxiety, dealing with divorce, high conflict divorce, if you can think about your child needs you to do this for you. Sometimes we need to have our kids as that reason that you need to focus on you for your child. And it's the number one thing that you can do for not only their health, but your own health as well.
I absolutely agree. And I think that it does, in the divorce process, that message does get lost. And part of the reason it gets lost is because, even just from a financial standpoint, when they calculate child support, they'll calculate who has more days, who has more overnights. I mean, that's part of how you determine, at least in New York, partially how you determine who's to receive child support. So that kind of feeds into it. I think that, when you're in the court, when you're under the court's eyes, I always say you're living your life under a microscope. And so, yeah, you have to go to all the games and you have to do this and you have to put on this, kind of show sort of, and one of the biggest gripes you always hear is that, oh, all of a sudden, so-and-so is so involved when they weren't before, and it feeds into the conflict. It feeds into the issues that go on between the parents. And again, I mean, the other thing that I say all the time, beyond taking care of you, you need to, as best as you can, rise above the petty and really be able to co-parent with, your child's, other parent, because that is also, I mean, you have to recognize that just because someone is a bad spouse does not make them a bad parent. And it's very hard for people to make that difference because they're so hurt. But it is one of the worst things you can do is to badmouth the other spouse, to alienate the other spouse. Doing all of that and tying your children into your world, to talk to your children about the divorce, talk to your children about the spouse. I mean, all of that is so bad for your kids. Even though you want them to understand why you're so angry, you feel the need to justify yourself, but you really can't. I talk a lot about that in the book because I think it's just such an important message.
It is. So, and let's go there right now in terms of what are the don'ts about talking to our kids about divorce, and what are the things that parents should be thinking about having conversations, and in what vein?
I mean, when we talk about the don'ts, I am a big advocate of, I would rather you give your children less information, at least at this point, unless you two are totally on the same page and united, than more. And again, it's sort of a general statement because it depends a lot on the age of the children. It depends on a lot of different things. But conceptually speaking, I think that, it's hard because when you do have children that are older, you also don't want to be lying to them. And this is always the big debate, because if your kid says to you, let's say your kid's 12 or, 11, 12, 13, like old enough to sort of know what's going on, but young enough probably not to process it 100%. So your child, sees the two parents fighting, sees them, whatever, picking up on things, has a friend whose parents got divorced and heard it started this way. And they turn to you and they say, are you and daddy, or you and mommy getting divorced? So if you say no, then, you calm your child, because let's say you don't know exactly what's happening, or you are, but you're not there yet, or you don't have a parenting plan in place, whatever it is. You say no. So fine, the kid feels fine. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, or a month later, you say, oh, by the way, we're getting divorced. Now your child feels they've been lied to, and it causes a huge issue there. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, if you say, you know what, mommy and I are thinking about, we are getting divorced, but you have no plan for them, then that causes an enormous amount of anxiety in these children. One of the things that we deal with first, when someone says they want to get divorced, one of the very first things we deal with is custody and parenting agreements. Because for me, your kids, kids are also very narcissistic and by nature. And so they want to know how this is going to affect them. That's the first thing they're going to want to know. They want to know where they're going to live. They want to know, is their pet going to come with them? They want to know, am I getting 2 birthday parties? They're going to want to know all the things that relate to them at first. And, when I'm a big believer that when you have this conversation with your children, have those answers for them. Because it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, even with COVID and everything else. Your kids need security. They need stability, structure, and security. And you as the parents, as best as you can, want to be able to provide that for them, especially when you're about to tell them something that in their world is going to shatter, because they live in very small worlds. Mm-hmm. And, and I always joke, like, when you have a parent that drops a kid off at a bus stop, and then as they're waiting, they always think I say this in the book too, how much fighting can you do? You sat at the bus stop all day waiting for me, because that's all they see. It's only, their world. You're just mom or dad. You don't have worlds outside of them. Especially when they're very young. And, and I think, as we were saying before, it's important for them to see that you do once they obviously get a little older. But my point being, though, is that I think it's very important to settle access schedules. And when I say access, I mean parenting schedules as soon as possible. So you can tell the children, this is where you're going to live. This is when you're going to be with mommy. This is going to be with daddy. It's going to be great. All the positive. We love you so much. This is obviously nothing that you did. This is just mommy and daddy love each other, and we love you, but we realize we're happy you're not being together. Whatever your, kind of speech is going to be. But I also am a big advocate of saying it together.
Right.
Do not have that speech separately, and do not cast blame. You know, no matter, and I know how hard that can be, especially if one person ended the marriage and the other person's very hurt by it, especially if they didn't do it in the right way. All these things can be very, very difficult to sit and bite your tongue sitting next to each other saying, well, we've made this decision together, but you need to do that. I mean, it is so incredibly important. You know, and one thing I'd also like to know is just, and I know this is about children, but, you know, even adult children, like children all over the place should not be tied into your marriage. And, you know, people like feel like, well, when you're a teenager, you're 18, you're 17, whatever it is, you're old enough to absorb it. You should know what's really going on. No.
Right.
They're still children. And you need to, and people do that all the time because they all of a sudden feel that the child's old enough to be able to process it. And they feel the need to explain. You know, they don't want to be the bad parent, especially if, you know, mom or dad left the house, even if mom or dad did something, but yet they're the ones, they don't want to get blamed for it.
I'm hearing, be aligned and do it together. Don't blame. Have your agreements mostly resolved, in order to be able to give them some concrete answers to the questions they have about where am I going to be, who am I going to live with, and the messaging to stay on. We both care about you. We both love you. And is it that our family is just going to look different? Like how is that messaging continue?
Yeah, I mean, that could be, you know, definitely that's one of them. I mean, there's a lot of different, you know, spins on this, and it really depends on what you're most comfortable with. And, you know, and I bring in a lot of times like parenting coaches into my cases for parents to go and meet with this person and really kind of sometimes script it, like verbatim. I think having a parenting coach is really important, you know, parenting coordinators, parenting coaches, all of that. To be honest, they're also less expensive than I am. So you might as well work with people that do this all day long. But yeah, I think family is going to be different. We're still a family. You know, I think that, again, you want to just let them know it's going to be okay. It's going to be different, and that's true. But different isn't always bad, you know, and, you know, it's okay to have change. And, you know, a lot of people will say, you know, especially depending again on the age of the children, you know, one of the big skills you can teach your child is how to be adaptable to change. And, you know, and again, this COVID thing, you know, when I try to see silver linings in it, one of them is that children are having to learn how to be creative and how to be adaptable. And I think that there's a lot of value in that because if anything, we're learning now that life is not as predictable as you think it is. And so, you know, people need to have coping mechanisms. And, you know, it's like kind of when you let your baby, you know, cry themselves to sleep at some point and learn how to self-soothe, I think there's value in that. So,
yeah, you know, and
I think these are all things.
Yeah. And you've talked about, you mentioned to try to avoid getting the situation where a child's going to say, well, you lied to me. So the thing that I have seen a lot over the years is, so the age of the child. So of course, when we have a younger child, it's easier to be very direct, broad strokes, very aligned. When you have these older kids, these astute kids, these perceptive kids that know something's awry, they know that there was something been going on in the relationship, or know that this is not a mutual decision, that is really tough because parents are then in a situation of, like what we're saying is, keep the party line, but an older child will know that it's disingenuous at some point. Can you speak to that situation?
I mean, I can tell you it's really hard. It's a true challenge. You know, again, and this is not because of what my parents do for a living, but, you know, I am a big advocate of therapy and children having their person, especially when they're going through a divorce process. And so if the children are already in therapy, you know, I really advocate speaking to the therapist before having the conversation with the child. So you'll know the best language to use for these kids. Like some kids can take it, you know, and some kids can't. And you need to kind of have a sense of your child and, you know, sometimes you may think your kid can take it when they can't. So again, if you have a therapist or somebody that they are, you know, able to speak to in a way that they may not be able to speak to their parents, that's always a positive.
For sure.
If you don't have that, I think it's super challenging. I think that, you know, you can do your best to not lie, but say things like, you know, and again, if we're dealing with teenage type children, say to them, listen, mommy and daddy are working things out. We're not 100% sure how this is going to fall out, but the one thing that we are 100% sure of is that you're going to be okay. You're our number one priority, and we're going to make sure that no matter whatever decisions are made, you're going to have security, and we're going to have a plan that works for you because you're our number one priority. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's not the greatest answer in the world. It feels a little political, and they may or may not leave it alone, and they may push. And you can say, look, you can also have some vulnerabilities if you truly feel like you can't say something to your child or uncomfortable, and saying, I don't have all the answers right now, but I'm going to. Mm-hmm. And when I do, I'm going to talk to you about it. And that, again, it's great if you actually can figure things out before that. But if your kids, stop you, on the street and basically are like, all right, what's going on? Right. And you don't want to, lie to them and stuff, then you can say things like that. But it's all about making them know that they're their number one priorities and that you are going to give them security, mm-hmm. because that's truly what the underlying message question is. Mm-hmm. And so mm-hmm. you have to do that as best as you can.
And just like all parenting, we're going to make mistakes, and we don't get the manual. And most people who go through divorce are going through it for the first time with their kids. And so we have to be kind to ourselves too. I think that's really important. And, you prepare, you have your kids' best, you have your best intentions, your kids' interest in mind. You've done preparation, and still all you can do is the best you can. And there's no way of predicting how your child may act in the moment or may act a month later. So it is about adapting. And this brings me to the whole idea of the research and the experience of, well, can kids actually be better off? Can everyone be healthier once divorce happens, as opposed to this old idea that we need to stay together for the kids?
So I think they can. And again, I'm not pro-divorce. Just to kind of throw it out there, I'm very, when someone comes to my office, one of the first things I say is, are you sure you want to get divorced? And they hesitate for a millisecond. I say, go see a therapist. Don't be here unless you're sure. That said, I do believe very much, and again, there's a chapter in the book that talks to this, that many children can be much better off after a divorce. And for the reasons behind that is that, if you're growing up in a home where, first of all, if there's any physical violence, that is just, that automatically is role modeling a behavior that is going to be a cycle. And we all know about the cycle of violence and all of that. So that's a definite, obvious one. But, more often than not, you have people that, it's just a loveless marriage. There's not abuse. There's not, screaming in the home, but there's just, it's loveless. And, and people say, well, that's better than if it's a loveless marriage, then I might as well stay in it, because then at least the kids, are okay. And I always say, stop for a second, because again, you're the role models of what a relationship should be. Mm-hmm. Your mm-hmm. kids are watching this marriage and they're saying, this is what I want when I grow up, because this is what I know. And do you want your child to be in a loveless marriage? I say to clients, I want you to think about, your son or your daughter, and think, how would I feel as a parent if my child was in the same marriage that I'm in? And if they say, well, that would make me miserable to think my child's living their lives this way, then I say, okay, think about that. Mm-hmm. Because that's what you're doing. You are teaching them this. And so I think I think it's really important that children, if children see their parents in separate homes, but happy homes, and they see their parents be happy people, I think that is better role modeling and better for your children than living together and not being happy.
So important. I mean, it's so important what you're saying, Jacqueline, is that we are teaching our kids how to be adults, how to be in relationships, what kind of feelings to have about work, to have about extracurriculars, to have about money. We're teaching them everything. And even when they don't like some of it, we all know that we do inherit from a nature and nurture a point of view, our parents' behaviors and ideas and values. We unconsciously absorb them. So yeah, to your point, living together in a loveless marriage, or someone observing their parents being in love and enjoying life and smiling and having excitement, that makes a difference. And, that is consistent with all of the research for decades when it comes to child adjustment and wellness, it was based on not whether parents are together or apart. It was the degree of their relationship conflict and how well or not the parents got along.
No, absolutely. And I think that is important. And, it also goes back to adaptability. I mean, there have been studies that have talked about children of divorce are more adaptable, because they needed to be. And I think that there's, and again, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And I think there's a lot of value in being able to cope and adapt. So I think, that's another benefit that people can derive from, divorce and things like that. And I'm not saying that would be the reason you do it, but I am saying that, there are perks to the whole situation that could be beneficial to your children.
So if you have one thing to recommend to parents who are about to or are in the divorce process, what is one recommendation if there was only one thing they had the capacity to focus on right now?
I mean, it's a great question. I feel like I have a few, so it's hard to narrow it to just one. But if I was going to say just one, it's really being, thinking about your children and being as present for your children as you can be, and recognizing that the actions, kind of taking a step back from the emotions that you're feeling at the moment and taking a step back and thinking about how this is going to impact my child and how I'm going to move forward with it. And, especially when you're going through the divorce and you're fighting about every little tiny thing, it's kind of like step back. One thing I say, and this kind of ties into this, is, a lot of times, especially when, you have people that are going to war and are just really being awful to each other, I say, how do you want your children, your children 10, 20 years, 30 years from now to describe their parents' divorce? Do you want your children to say, oh my God, they were at full war with each other and I was caught in the middle and it was awful and, and just all these horrible, horrible memories? Or do you want them to say, you know what? I know my parents went through a divorce. They kept me out of it. And at the end of the day, I knew they both loved me. And that was really all I cared about. And that's what you think about. Like, what is there going to be their description? Because you can dictate what their future narrative is. And I think it's really important.
So well said. I love that question too. Looking back, how do you want them to see this process? Okay, Jacqueline, it is time for the Parent Footprint Moment question. Tell us about a time when you became aware of yourself as a person or as a parent, and that new awareness had a positive impact on your child.
So it's something that happened fairly recently, and it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about. So I was with my daughter, and I was driving, very slowly, like right outside of my block, and I had a blind spot, and I had gotten into a very slight fender bender. Like my car was fine; it was just like a bump, and it was one of those things. It was completely my mistake. I was going the back, whatever. It was totally my error, and it was one of those things. Like in the moment, I realized I made a complete mistake. It was totally my fault. And, and I turned to my child who, at this moment in her life, she thinks that everything I do is perfect and holds me on this great pedestal. And I know I've got only a small blip of time that's going to happen, but that's where she is right now. And I turned to her, I was like, that was 100% my mistake. That was completely, I should not have been doing what I was doing. And that was my error. And at first, I almost got defensive on in my own head. And that, 5 seconds of time, I was going to make an excuse for it and say it was their fault that they parked their car outside. I was all ready to take blame and, defer it and say, oh, why would they do that? And they know there's a blind curve and all this stuff. But you know what? It wasn't their fault. I mean, they shouldn't have parked where they did. And that's true, but it was my fault. And I saw it as an opportunity for my daughter to see I make mistakes. I own the mistake. When the woman came out, I started right away being like, I am 100% sorry, 100% liable. Tell me what I owe you. It was totally my fault. But I was so glad in a weird way that my child saw that entire exchange. And I was really proud of myself to not blame anyone else, to take responsibility and let my child see it. And I was also very calm. I didn't get excited. And so I felt like it was such a teaching moment for myself to say, you know what, keep it in check and recognize this was your error and let your daughter see that you make mistakes. And then also for her to see it. And I even used it later. I said, I recognize that was my mistake and I make mistakes and I owned it. And then I said, I'm proud of myself for owning it. I was going to get defensive and I didn't because you know what? It was my screw up, period. And so it was really, I felt like it was a very good moment for all of us. I mean, it wasn't great because I had to pay for these people's car, but conceptually speaking, it was a very good parenting
That
moment.
was an amazing parenting moment. That is awesome. I mean, and because our natural reaction, particularly in those kind of situations, is like to blame. I mean, it's just like we're psychologically protecting ourselves, and then we have to, So well done. Well done. And your child got
it definitely goes up there.
Yeah. All right. You do get a trophy for that one.
Thank you.
So Jacqueline, tell everyone, I mean, to check out your book, the new rules of divorce, 12 secrets of protecting your wealth, health, and happiness. And for Oprah to give this a huge shout out. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, I was pretty excited.
So tell everyone where they can find it and continue to follow your work.
Sure. So the new rules of divorce can be found on Amazon. You can buy it at barnesandnoble.com, pretty much where books are sold. In regards to, following us, you can go to nycdivorcelawyer.com. Straight
and simple right there. nycdivorcelawyer.com. How'd you get that one? That's a great domain name right there.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for just the focus on kids and the focus on parents being aware of who they are in this process and in their own life. And of course, that's so aligned with what we do at Parent Footprint. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us this morning.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It's nice speaking with you.
All right, everyone, that is a wrap for another show. Remember, always try to be the person you want your child to become. Remember, they are always watching and you are always teaching. Check us out at www.parentfootprint.com. Subscribe to the podcast. Tell your friends. Join us in the mission to make the world a more loving and compassionate place, one parent and one child at a time. And as always, ask yourself the guiding question: what footprint do you want to leave?